Good afternoon, and welcome to the Allen D. Lehman Swine Conference. My name is Pedro Urriola. I'm a research associate professor at the Department of Animal Sciences and the Department of Veterinary Population Medicine of the University of Minnesota. I hope that you had a wonderful break from this morning's sessions and that you had time to stretch and relax. Now it's time to grab some coffee and gear up for the second half of the day. We have a great program for you. Earlier this morning, some of you may have listened about the great work from our keynote speakers who introduce current issues attaining the pork industry. While these speakers this morning describe an industry that is in crisis, we want to show you that every crisis brings opportunities. To pork producers, these opportunities can be to review cost, to review optimal throughput, or how many animals do we need to really produce through our facilities and given the capacities that we have. And also maybe an opportunity to get rid of those diseases that keep dragging your system or the productivity of your farms behind. We feel that the moment is now. The situation is critical, and therefore, as Winston Churchill once time said, we shouldn't waste a good crisis. We think the same, so let's not waste it. Therefore, our session today is Don't Waste a Good Crisis, Opportunities in Production. Our first presenter will be Mark Schwartz from Schwartz Farms. Mark is the Director of Production System, and he is responsible for the operational management of all Schwartz Farm farrowing facilities, as well as ensuring seamless integration with production system between farrowing and wean to finish operation. You will see that Mark is a person that understands production systems. For those of us that have always the pleasure to interact with Mark, he is a person of numbers. He talks and thinks of production numbers that move their system. And I hope you will see that on today's presentation from Mark. The title for today's presentation from Mark is Cost and Productivity Analysis in the Midst of the COVID Shutdown. With further ado, welcome Mark.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas with you during this session for the 2020 Lehman Conference. The title of this session is Responding to Crisis, and of the three presentations, each will have a different focus. And the first being sharing the situation at hand during the shutdown and slowdown of the processing plants earlier this year due to COVID. The second one, more looking forward as a production company, is how do we perhaps adjust our thinking or have a different paradigm having gone through this. And the third one, to look at and discuss and think on how do we use situations such as the one we had just been through to improve and enhance the health of our U.S. swine herd. A bit of background first, I think, is necessary to understand the situation. The North American pork production model really has evolved over the past 30 years into a system of all in, all out production with multi-site production, with typically 3 site being breeding herd, nursery, and finishing, or breeding herd and wean to finish. And in that model is built in the optimization of the building utilization. Much of the nursery or grow finish and wean finish production is contract production. And so the days in which there are no pigs in a barn is the cost of the owner of the pig or the integrator. And those are days which are worked to be minimized for efficient production. Likewise, slaughter weights have increased year over year for the past 25 to 30 years to optimize that slaughter weight, to produce pounds of pork efficiently. That being currently 275 to 290 pounds approximately, depending on each processor's, packer's matrix. And likewise, the slaughter plants have worked to efficiently utilize their capacity. And so really it's become a kind of a just-in-time equivalent in production. We want to maximize wean pig output. As an industry, for the most part, we've settled in at approximately a 20-day lactation length, or 20-day wean age, in a 20-group system. And so there are some production systems have moved to a batch system, and for health enhancement reasons, and there's some of that, but primarily 20-group system in which every week pigs are weaned from a farm, and the farrowing rooms are washed, disinfected, and refilled with the next sows due to farrow. Likewise, in the nurseries and the wean finish barns and finishing barns, after the pigs are either moved from the nursery to finishing or from finishing to market, the barn is washed and disinfected and then refilled with the next group of pigs. And so again, whether that's a contract arrangement or owned by the owner of the pigs or the integrator, there's a cost to that. There's either a cash outlay or an opportunity cost, depending on the situation. So either way, there's a cost, and the goal is to minimize what we call the down days or the empty days. Likewise, on the other part of the equation, slaughter plants and processors work to maximize or optimize their throughput. They want to minimize down days, and Saturdays are used for flex days, depending on season and margins and so on. And so again, the goal is to work to optimize the throughput of the units of pork per unit of labor and per capital and investment and so on. And so each portion of that whole process is worked to be full and to be operating efficiently. You look at the coming into the situation in April of 20. This graphic I obtained from the National Pork Board, and what I did is portrayed the packing plants and their capacities, and there's lots of smaller ones that are lumped together. But what I'm portraying is that we were running as an industry at full capacity. As you round off these numbers and look at the capacities, we're about 490,000 pigs per day is our capacity in the United States to process. And so we were at full capacity. As new plants came online in the last several years, the pigs were there to fill those plants. Likewise, in our sow slaughter capacity, there is little flex. They are running full, and there's little room to process additional sows than what we are currently processing now and have been. And so you look at what had occurred in the past approximately 5 to 6 years, from 2009 to 2013 approximately, we were running, the sow herd was fairly flat, and expansion that occurred over the past 5, 6, 7 years, again, filled these plants to capacity and filled us as an industry running at capacity and having little room for flex. And so then when the slowdowns and shutdowns occurred in April and May of 20, due to the COVID situation, the market hog price, which already was not profitable, was very marginal, plummeted because there was no room. There's no room for flex to take on additional pigs from other plants. And so this is the point in the presentation here, because I focused on numbers and efficiency and utilization, and the difficult part was trying to reconcile at that point in time, again, several months ago. How do you reconcile our animal care and our husbandry and efficiency in this time of crisis? And it doesn't matter if it's a large sow farm or a large system or finishing sites and nurseries, or it's one of my daughter's summer project of raising 3 pigs at her grandmother's. And we're all livestock producers, veterinarians, caretakers, and managers of livestock. We're stewards of these livestock. We're not working with little protein machines. And how do we reconcile that? It was very difficult in that point in time to try to grasp what we were going through. And so really, at that time in April and May, it was emotionally draining for the owners of the livestock, the managers, the supervisors, the caretakers, and trying to explain this reality of the situation of how we have to respond to this. And after having worked very hard for many years in ongoing training and continuous training for the caretakers on animal husbandry and animal care, and then trying to explain why we have to move this bar for what's an acceptable pig and one that's not now that was yesterday. And I have always believed and continue to believe that efficient production is sustainable production. And when we went through this slowdown and shutdowns, and when there's no market for these animals, the inefficiencies were everywhere of having to adjust to this reality of what we were going through and trying to understand whether it was an employee on the farm or a manager owner of the waste that had to occur because of the situation of people starving and not being able to provide this animal for food to the people that needed it. It's also important to bear in mind the hog production cycle and why it was difficult, and not to downplay in any means what all sectors went through, agriculture and others, and from dairy to having to dump milk and laying hens with no market for the eggs, and beef plants and so on, and turkeys. But what is unique to pork production is the production cycle. And again, not to downplay the situation, but there's a much shorter planning horizon for broilers or turkeys than there is for raising a pig. With the gestation length and nursery phase, finishing phase, there are 5 months of pigs in this production pipeline, which stopped for some segments and some parts of the industry. And so the realities of the shutdown was, and there's a complete absence of a market at any price for certain classes of livestock. For these pigs that have value as food, we call substandard or number 2 pigs, or the roaster pigs, there is no market. There's no market for them. You cannot sell them at any price, at zero. You can't give them away. Boars and some classes of sows that we work hard to care for and raise, that there became an absence of this market. And so at some point, for some point in time, or period of time in earlier this year, these animals really took on a negative value. They became a liability at that time when you did not know what was going to happen in 2 months or 4 months or 6 months in the marketplace. And so every day that pig became a bigger liability because you put more cost into it and it had no value. And so when you're in that point in time, you work to conserve spaces. You work to prevent the pigs from becoming too big to market that are in the grow finish phase. And so you work to change the diet, and you work to increase the temperature in the barn to reduce intake somewhat. You work to attempt to take it longer for that pig to consume its daily intake to slow down that growth. And then on the other side of that production pipeline, if you want to call it that, you work to slow down the inflow of the pig into the nursery because you're trying to conserve those spaces. And so the difficult decisions of reducing the group size due to farrow. If you have 100 sows due to farrow, for example, in a week, and you decide that that number may have to be 95 or 94 or some percent of full capacity because you do not have room for that pig in 3 or 4 weeks. And the difficult decisions of minimum quality standards at weaning of pigs that were acceptable only the day before. And likewise at birth, of how do you make that decision as an animal caretaker when they understand there is no place for that pig to go. And so those were the realities in April and May of 2020. At the same time, it forces you as a producer to look at every input, because you don't know at that point in time what will be the value of that pig in 5 months approximately. And so you look at every vaccination you give, from a PRRS vaccine to autogenous bacterians and others. Why put cost into a pig that may not have value? And you look to evaluate all inputs that do not jeopardize the well-being or welfare of the sow and her piglets, or the pig in the nursery phase, in the finishing phase. And it's difficult because you're looking to reducing the inputs that are perhaps 0.5% of the value of the market pig. And when in that point in time, when there is no market for a pig because the slaughter plants are closed or slowed down greatly, the real answer was not to make that pig. But that decision would have had to have been made 6 months previous. And so that became the difficult reality. And so fortunately, the situation recovered much quicker than was forecast at the point in time in which we did not know how long the plant would be closed, how long it would be running at a portion of its capacity. And so as the graphic shows here, in April and May, far more pigs than there was ability to process those pigs, and coming back, and this is a source from the USDA, it's coming back to somewhat close to capacity. But again, at that point in time, you did not know. Now looking forward on the futures market from the graphic from the CME group, it would look as though a pig 9 months from now is going to be worth almost $40 per pig more than a pig today. And so attempting to understand, again, in the 6-month planning horizon, where should we be? How many pigs should we be producing? And so they're going through that phase, or that time period in April and May of this past year, and attempting to learn from that as a producer, and those in the pig producers and those in the industry. As always, we have to be and remain a low-cost producer. We sell a commodity, which is pigs, to the processor. And to maintain that focus on productivity and quality and animal care and husbandry, that again, I believe that efficiency and productivity is sustainability in the production systems that we operate and as an industry. It helped us to look at and force as producers to look at inefficiencies created by health challenge flows. Why are we living with health challenge flows? How do we clean up these herds quicker, regardless of the value of that pig? Because we're able to, because we could get by, and do we have to change that thinking? It forces producers to identify processes and inputs which don't produce a return, don't have a value to your system. And again, it forces you to do that, and in normal times, you look at it and evaluate, but in times such as that we went through, it really forces the question and forces to produce an answer to that. And always, as in anything you go through, as in any industry, any company, is to be stronger on the backside of adversity, to come out of that hoping you learned and you were able to learn from that situation that you just went through. So I thank you for your kind attention. I hope I've shared some thoughts and ideas and with you on this topic, and we'll continue in the rest of this session. I want to thank the Layman Conference Planning Committee for their invitation for me to be part of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, for such insightful presentation. Let's continue with this great set of presentations of the session on Don't Waste a Good Crisis, Opportunities in Production. Our next speaker is Jeff Worstell. Jeff is Chief Operating Officer at Tri-Oak Foods. Jeff has been at this role since 2018, where he is working as a senior executive with the task of overseeing day-to-day operation and administrative function of the large production system and also some merchandise business. Prior to this position, Jeff was Director of Marketing Access at Boehringer Ingelheim Animal Health in the United States, and he was also President of Cargill Pork for more than 11 years. Therefore, Jeff brings strong knowledge of the pork industry, and the title of Jeff's presentation is Projecting Optimal Throughput. What will post-COVID-19 throughput optimization look like? Welcome, Jeff. Looking forward to your presentation.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Pedro, for that introduction. A few weeks ago, I was given this topic for today, post-COVID throughput and optimization. When I was given that, I'm like, I was scratching my head on, what does that mean? I even asked others, people I work with. I even asked the person who gave me the topic and said, what does that mean? Well, Jeff, I mean, you'll come up with something. So I go, okay. I actually came up with something. I came up with, I want to use this as an opportunity to challenge ourselves versus the traditional way when we think about throughput and optimization. So I want to discuss that today. So first, I need to set the stage. Years ago, I had the opportunity, as when I worked for Cargill, to be in a leadership development class. I was in that class with people from all over North America, and we came in that morning, and the classroom was different. The tables were pushed aside, the chairs were pushed aside, and as we walked in, the instructor is over to the side, he's ripping off pages from a flip chart marker, and he's laying them on the floor here in front of us. And he kept ripping those off and welcoming us into the class until he had one square for everybody. He says, hey, this morning we're gonna play a little exercise. It's simple, the rules are simple. I need everyone to put 2 feet in a square, and then I'm gonna say the word change. And with that, I'd like you to move to another square, and I won't say change again until I look around the room and everybody is in a square. Okay, you know, this isn't our first rodeo. We kind of understand and we start to think, okay, wonder where this is headed. So he says change, but at this point everyone's relaxed. He says change, and so we calmly move, and everyone goes to a different square. Wonder where this is headed. So now it says change again, and we continue, we move. Okay, but everyone's starting to think, you know, he's going somewhere. We're just not going to keep saying change and move around. There's a point. We're all trying to figure it out because we're competitive. Then all of a sudden, he says, change again. And this time, before everyone can get their feet in a square, he bends down and he quickly picks up paper and he removes these squares. Now all of a sudden, there's not enough squares for everybody to have their feet in one. But as soon as he does that, everyone's tense. All right? They're prepared now to act. Now they're starting to think strategically. Oh, I see, the game is on. So they're looking, right? They're surveying their marketplace. I can get there because she's going to move there, and I'm the best person to fit there. If I turn to the side, I'll block them and I'll get my square. And then once I get my feet in the square, because I'm a nice guy, I'll look around. Hey, Cindy, I think there's room for you back here. And so the game progressed that way. Everyone now started just doing what they'd always done, but head down, tense, ready to act, faster and more efficiently than everyone else that was in the class. That keeps going until there's one square left. And our class is sitting and we're talking to ourselves going, this instructor in a few minutes is going to have to tell us something that he's never told any previous class. And that is, you guys are the first ones to figure it out. I'm going to tell the leaders of Cargill they no longer need to worry about the future because of employees like you are in the company. Well, we thought we were so smart because there wasn't room for all of us to stand in a square. But if we lay on our back, we put our feet in there, because all he said was we had to have 2 feet in a square. So we did it. We're so proud of ourselves. And I come to find out, he didn't congratulate us and tell us what a great job we had done. You know what he told us? He said, you've done exactly what every other class has done. And he said, you actually did exactly what I wanted you to do. So as squares were being removed, what did we do? We thought winning was doing the same thing I did in the beginning, but I got to be faster. I got to be more efficient. And that's how I'll win. I'll find myself on my back with my feet in the air, fighting over one last square. Let me further illustrate this to you from some examples in the business world and then tie it back to our pork industry. So I chose Ford Motor Company. It's personal to me. Unfortunately, I own a lot of Ford Motor Company way over here. Long time at a much higher value. And look what's happened to it. So with Ford Motor Company, they've had squares. This is just a few I pulled up. Lyft, Uber, Tesla. Squares have been removed from their industry. How did they respond? Well, they all got in a conference room and said, you know what we need to do? We need to consolidate operations. We need to take this out of North America and we need to consolidate this in South America. We need to do this with our parts. We need to discontinue the manufacturing of that line because you know what we need to do? To be successful, we need to do the same thing we've always done. Keep our head down, focus on efficiency, focus on cost, make sure all the employees out there in the plant know, right, that we're going to reward them for being efficient and maximizing throughput. Well, we're the marketplace, you and me. We decide, do we want to own Ford stock? Do we want to sell it? Well, obviously, we've decided that looking at Ford and how they react to the industry, the squares, well, there's more of us that rather sell it than to buy it. Now let's talk a few other examples. So hopefully this drives it home what I'm talking about, squares being removed. Hopefully all of these are familiar with you. Let's go to each one specifically. Kodak filed for bankruptcy. Interesting enough, did you know who developed the digital technology? It was Kodak. But yet they're the ones that filed for bankruptcy. Odd. Why? Squares were being removed from the industry, and they said, you know what? We're going to ignore those. People will always want a hard copy of that picture. So we're going to focus all of our efforts on film. They filed for bankruptcy. Pony Express. You remember reading about that in your history books. You've seen old Western movies, and you think that the Pony Express must have lasted for a decade or decades. But in reality, from when it was first conceived to when it ran its last route, it only had an 18-month lifespan. Wow, I didn't know that. The Telegraph. That was their Black Swan event. Made them no longer relevant. Did they see that coming? Did they see the work on that? Squares being removed? Encyclopedia Britannica. Some of you might not even be old enough to remember Encyclopedia Britannica. Their president spoke to all their employees and the public and said, we're not worried about the changing environment. He didn't say this part, but he kind of alluded to it. We're not worried about squares being removed from our industry. He said, what you don't understand is people view us as a work of art. I'm not worried. You shouldn't be worried. They'll always want a set of our encyclopedias on their bookshelf because we're a work of art. 1 year later, they finished. They printed their last set of encyclopedias. Squares were removed from their industry, and they just said we need to focus on efficiency and throughput. Intel. Most people, when they hear the word Intel, they think of Andy Groves, the CEO, a lot of his famous quotes and his thoughts about business, and they go, I don't understand. Why would that one be on that list? Well, same thing. Squares were being removed from their industry. The biggest square was this device right here. And they missed it. When this square came apart upon the industry, they said, you know, people will use this to make phone calls and probably listen to music. But I don't ever see a day in which people will actually conduct business from this device. So Intel's probably in your laptop that you're using. Intel's probably in the computer that I'm using today to do this presentation. But Intel is not in here. Intel's not inside. So they've laid off people. They've laid off 6,000 people, 1,200 people. They're trying to remake themselves because squares were being removed from their industry. And how did they respond? Brings us to the last one, Rand McNally. I remember early in my career, before I would head out, I'd take my right arm and I'd put it behind the seat and make sure I felt that Rand McNally atlas, that I had it with me. That when I went, I'd never be lost. I bet most of you today can't find your Rand McNally atlas, or have never had one, or you threw it away. In this particular case, the company literally had to change direction. They saw squares being removed from their industry, and they knew they were no longer going to be the preferred supplier of that atlas. People weren't going to take pride in getting it out and telling their kids, here's where we're going on the map, when their kids are over there on the phone and going, well, Dad, there's a faster route. So they saw squares, and they said, we need to look at logistics, planning, route maximization. And so they changed before they were forced to. So now let's start getting specific about our industry, the pork industry. I borrowed this slide. Angie Krieger presented this a few weeks ago, and when it went up, I was shocked to see where pork was. We're 6th here, dead last in this category. Good for me and my family. You know what I thought? Well, we're obviously not telling our message. They must not know how much time we spend on throughput and optimization, increasing average daily gain, pigs per sow per year. We just obviously don't get our message out because that's what we focus on. I think you know that's sarcasm. That's not what they're using to make their decisions. what we have to face our reality as it is, not as it once was, or you wish it to be. This is where 50% of the US population lives today, in these small colored spots. You might say with COVID, that actually is a square that got removed, and that could change a little bit, but it's not going to change drastically. So the people that are making decisions about, do they choose pork? What information are they getting? How they do it? These people, they don't think like us. They're never going to think like us. They have different experiences. Today, tomorrow, they're not making decisions based on our throughput. So we need to understand that. They're getting all sorts of sources of information, ways to shop differently, to get groceries at home. Who would ever thought that was going to be so significant? Who do I trust? Who do I go to? How am I going to do things differently? Well, I'll just Google it and find out the answer. Some squares can be negative for one and positive for the other. COVID-19, there was definitely a point in time when it was negative for our industry. Instead of killing 490,000 a day, we were harvesting 290,000 a day. We were getting backed up. We couldn't get the product to the retailer. An opportunity for them, the square being removed from us, they said, well, this is our opportunity. We're going to market and get people to try this that have never thought about trying it, mostly because that's all that there is. So they're thinking about that square. How do they respond? How do we respond? How do we get them to choose us? Let's think about you as a veterinarian in your role. Too much, we've spent a lot of time talking about our throughput. And we'll use that to rationalize these outcomes. Hey, do you understand that our sow mortality keeps going up every year? I do, but hey, good news is we're producing more pigs out the farm than we ever have. Have you also noticed our pre-weaning mortality is going up? Yeah, but those are consequences. We're producing more pigs now than we ever have. So I got to get my head down, I got to tense up, and I'm going to focus on throughput and optimization and efficiency, because that's how I win. I'm going to get to that square faster than my competition. We find ourselves rationalizing. You as a trusted veterinarian, right? If they ask you the questions, do you answer, hey, what you got to consider is a light that burns twice as bright probably won't burn as long. So when we're producing all these pigs, it's just a consequence. So all you're thinking about is throughput and optimization. Accountability. With what I've described, it's kind of like if you want to look for these slides, this is broken. Is this you? Do you know this person? How do we get them to choose us? They're not choosing us because we focus on throughput and optimization. Don't get me wrong. I think we know every business has to constantly look to continuously improve and be efficient. That's not the point. The point isn't saying, hey, let's take cost competitiveness and efficiency and ignore it. It's just saying that if that's all you do, I just got to be faster and more efficient. You'll wake up one day on your back with the feet in the air, fighting over one square. In the last 10 years, there's been multiple squares that have been removed. ractopamine, in some areas carbadox, free trade to no free trade to government intervention to antibiotic free to animal welfare to antibiotic resistance to COVID-19. How are we going to respond? Is it all about throughput and efficiency, or are we going to get in that trap? We started at 8 square feet, then we said, well, 8 square feet will work, so 7.5 square feet will work, so 7.2 square feet will work. We started off and we said for throughput and efficiency, we need to move sows into gestation crates. That way we'll be the most efficient. So it started and we were on 24 inches inside. Then someone said, hey, let's just cheat that a little bit and make it 24-inch centers. And someone said, well, I think 23 inches will work. Someone said 22 inches will work. And I've been to farms where, well, if we put all of our gilts here, we can go 19 inches, and instead of being 7 foot long, they'd be 6 foot long. We wonder, why are we last? Why aren't they choosing us? What role do you play? Are you providing the leadership? Group housing. Okay, we need to go to group housing. We don't know what we're running to. We've just been told what we need to run from, right? We're running from crates. Oh my gosh, they're horrible. Well, this person does 24 square feet. This one did 20. They were successful, and they said, well, you know, 20 worked. I bet we can do 18. Then the next person said, well, 18 works. Hey, if we go down to 16 square feet, think how we'll optimize throughput. I won't have to reduce my inventory. I'll be able to keep all of my walkways. I'm going to maximize efficiency and throughput. And then we wonder, you know, gosh, I've been confronted with, well, you're just factory farming. I get defensive. We're not. I don't like being called factory farms. Well, think about how you answer these questions. Are you thinking about doing things to influence people on why they should choose you? How it would be good for the family? That we're the product of choice? Or, again, what role do you play? What leadership role do you play? You don't have to be the CEO to influence change. You shouldn't be afraid of change. COVID-19 is just one other square that has been removed from our industry. I challenge you to think differently. Be aware that it's a square, and how do I respond? You play a role in making sure that we don't find ourselves on our back in 5 years with our feet in the air going, look, and we're all trying to fight and keep our piece of the pie, and our piece of the pie has shrunk to one tiny square. So I know you asked me to be here to talk about throughput and optimization. I'm taking it a different spin on it today. And I'm saying that that's all we do. We're going to be on our backs and thinking about how we continue to reduce costs and be more efficient. Versus saying, let's don't be afraid of change. And let's work really hard to make sure as squares are removed, how are we responding, and so that people will continue to choose us. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Jeff, for such thought-provoking presentation. I think that considering throughput of the operation is an essential step moving forward. We also want to think of those diseases that, for one reason or another, may have bringing your system or decreasing the productivity of your system. And it is important that nowadays we put really into consideration whether we should move forward and get rid of such issues or diseases that drag the system down. Therefore, I'm pleased to share the next presenter, Dr. Paul Yeske from the Swine Vet Center. Paul is a senior member of the veterinary team at the Swine Vet Center, which is a large veterinary service provider in Minnesota. Paul completed his Doctor of Veterinary Medicine in 1985 at Iowa State University. And like quoted in past introductions of Paul, he likes most aspects of his job, but he really likes working on farm research projects and record analysis, and along with records and partial budgets and modeling production system. Therefore, Paul is very qualified to speak on uh, getting rid of infectious diseases. Therefore, the presentation title from Paul is Taking Advantage of COVID-derived Interventions to Improve Health. With further ado, Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Pedro, and the organizing committee for inviting me to share some of our thoughts and be a part of the layman conference here today in looking at taking advantage of the COVID situation and driving interventions in health. And so again, to follow the title, to quote Winston Churchill, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so fortunately, I would have liked to have let COVID go to waste, but we've had to deal with it and go forward and do what we could as the best we could. And again, for today, I'd like to share some of our thoughts and some of the things our clients did. And it's not just me, but everyone at the Swine Vet Center, the veterinarians there, and the group at Swine Vet Center Research. I think we all know that COVID has certainly had an impact on us and has certainly brought us new rules to live by. History really hasn't helped us much with this disease since it's a new disease and we're really writing new chapters of history. And no one, I don't think, could have ever expected what we've seen. So what we've learned to know is expect change and expect the unexpected. And I think that's going to continue on as we go forward. So for this afternoon, what I would like to talk a little bit about is how we took some of these changes and worked to improve the health status of some of the herds, looking at using depopulation, repopulation, herd closures, and disease elimination, making holes in production to allow herds to stabilize, adjusting the production to get the proper wean age, and some farms even looking at using and converting to batch farrowing. So what was driving these decisions? Certainly at the time, we were running into the space needs as the packing plants started to close and the pigs started to back up and people started to look at opportunities, and we tried to look at ways they could take advantage of some of these opportunities to improve the health status of their herds. And certainly the market prices had the major impact on it here. With the current prices we have, the expected and continued losses going forward that we were looking at. And the question was often asked, are you better off to lose less? And many people being frustrated dealing with sick pigs, the high mortality, the poor growth, the unlikely to be profitable groups of pigs being placed out there. And so again, these were some of the drivers that took people there to make these kind of decisions. And this is just looking at some of the Iowa State numbers, the projected return per head, and you can see there's a lot of red ink there through 20, at the end of 19 and into 20, and there's a little bright spot hopefully out there in 21, but again, these were part of the things driving the decisions. And you can see here Dr. Steve Meyer's chart looking at what we saw happen with the packing. And if you look back in that April-May timeframe, we got down to about 50% of capacity, and looking at what we're going to be facing as we head into the fall here with bigger numbers and perhaps limited packing capacity, and no one really knows where that's going to end up. And so these things all driving some of these decisions of evaluating how production was done. Depopulation certainly has been the time-honored method for improving health status. We know that it's very effective. It works very well for a number of different diseases, and is, when executed properly, is nearly 100% effective. And so a lot of herds were dealing with tough strains of PRRS, and the downstream flow, the wean to finish pigs having problems and significant death loss, and especially if these pigs were commingled with other farms in the flow. And oftentimes these flows also had more than just the PRRS health problem. They had more than one health problem, such as mycoplasma as well. And it gave them the opportunity to look at how can we improve the health status. Some farms also had a parity distribution imbalance, having been through some herd closures or having some availability problems. And so it was a good opportunity to get the parity distribution back. And some farms looking at making genetic changes just for that reason alone, making the decision to go into a depopulation a little easier. And so as we talked about the depopulation, I think it's the first time that I can remember in my career that we went into herds closing and depopulating and not repopulating, some farms being mothballed, and again, waiting until there's better potential to start back up, and waiting for the market to improve or the opportunities to improve. And so again, it's a unique time frame where some of those things were done, and I think for some parties it made good sense. There were lots of cheap, healthy pigs that could be placed instead. Again, we know this was probably not going to be long-term sustainable because you can't continue to make these pigs for nothing, but it did allow time to decide into the future and an opportunity to start back with healthier pigs once the herd was decided to be repopulated. So again, repopulation is always a bit of a challenge as we've looked at the depop repops over the years, and timing is always a hard part of the decision. Again, if you look at the repopulation side of the coin, if you start too late, you'll miss the higher markets. If you start too early, you may lose too much money and not be able to be in business to get the profit once the higher markets come. And so it is somewhat of a challenge, and you have to kind of work at deciding when you're going to make those decisions. Again, some herds did choose to go ahead and do the depopulation, repopulation, and take the advantage on just cleaning up the health. Others took a little longer downtime, made the process a little bit easier on themselves. And again, trying to identify that time frame that they thought would hit into a better market. And we know that sow herds are very likely to perform much better than they had previously when they start with the depopulation, a new herd and healthy herd and new genetics. Oftentimes we see better performance than the old herd beats the new herd, or the new pigs beat the old pigs to market before we're done, even in a depopulation, repopulation with some downtime. The herd closures have been another method to stabilize health and to improve health. And we've really used this a lot in the last few years, and certainly in our industry with the multiple site production model, it's really fit for using this technology. The farrow to wean can be stabilized and there's no other pigs on site. And so it allows that site one to develop good solid immunity, stop shedding, and then we can empty out the wean to finish sites, essentially do a depop, repop on each of those sites as the sites turn. And then we can go ahead and stop that disease from moving through that population. We stop the introduction of new replacement animals. That's how we close that's why it's the herd closure. We do the old load, close, and homogenize the population to whatever disease we're wanting to control. And again, it allows for disease elimination without depopulation and repopulation. So part of the idea with the load, close, and homogenize is we get all those gilts in place that we're going to have during the time of the closure. We allow their immune system to stabilize and those sows to stop shedding the organism during the closure. We continue to flow those animals through the system. And then once all those animals are into the system, and we've got good evidence that we're no longer shedding the organism, then we can go ahead and bring those negative replacements back into the herd and be able to eliminate the organism. This procedure has worked very good for many different diseases and been very effective. Again, TG was one of the first ones we did this with for a long time. PRRS certainly has worked well, Mycoplasma influenza, PED once it came around, and the Delta Corona and the Seneca Valley virus are just to name a few here recently. And many times some of the smaller bugs, some of the smaller bacterial pathogens will also stabilize in those time frames and certainly improve if we don't necessarily get them eliminated from the system. But again, been very effective for many different organisms that herds may be dealing with. And what we've learned over time is that we can do this without losses in production or essentially no change in the breeding target, being able to maintain the number of animals coming through the system. And particularly for farms that have an internal gilt developer on site, has been very helpful for those to just flow those animals through. And then if we haven't had an internal GDU, then we've used an off-site housing to expose gilt, to put the exposed gilts on. Again, it does have a little bit more risk in that those animals are vulnerable to being exposed. Or we've also done the off-site breeding projects with the negative animals to bring back once the herd is stabilized. The challenge with this model is that you're committed once you start breeding the sows to have a place to farrow them if the herd hasn't stabilized by the time you get there. And the other option that a few people did this spring particularly was you can just close the herd and not load it. Just close the herd and let the inventory deteriorate. And it accomplishes the same goal by improving the health, but there's less sows and pigs within the system. And in the long run, may not affect the numbers as much as you'd think, especially once you go into that mode and you know that's what you're going to be doing. We've used a partial budget model here. I just show the partial budget on 1,000 sows just so people could do the math easy in their head. And we looked at some relatively modest changes here to the overall productivity. And you can see it adds up in a big hurry to almost over $13 a pig or almost $420 a sow. And so this is just using an example as to what you might be looking at. And if you do a depopulation, repopulation with an offsite breeding project to cut the downtime, you can see it's about $12 a sow. And if you don't do the offsite breeding project and just take the sow herd down and wait for it to come all the way back up doing the breeding on site, it's about $20 a sow. When we look at the herd closures, and you can see why herd closures have become more popular, we're talking of a range from $3 a sow down to $1.50 roughly on the various different styles of herd closures. So you can see why producers have taken a look at this. But I think it's interesting to see here with relatively modest changes in the performance there, you can see that even if we do a depopulation, repopulation, we're getting a return on investment within that first year. If we don't do a breeding project, it's going to take a little bit longer, more like 17 months to get that back, to get that money recovered back. And if we look at the herd closures, we can see some very nice returns on investment. And certainly I'd like to see if I couldn't figure out a way to get my retirement into that. You can see here that it's 1 to 2 years to get the return back on the initial investment for the depop, repop, and 1 to 3 months if we're doing the herd closures. And that's why the herd closures have gained a lot of popularity within the industry. The other method that people had worked on was to make a hole in production to allow herds to stabilize, kind of the same concept, but just making a hole to allow the herd to clean out, to stop shedding, etc. And so some producers looked at that, the issues, and said, we'll abort some sows, we'll make a window, hopefully the sow herd will stabilize, we can reduce numbers in the system, we won't have any pigs in farrowing for a while and try and stabilize some of the disease concerns that they were dealing with. Others decided to make a hole in production by euthanizing pigs and again, doing that same thing, making that window, making that hole. Many times these herds, or most of these herds, were having some issues, oftentimes with the bad strain of PRRS. Again, tried to reduce the number in the system, reduce the number of pigs, allowing the herd to stabilize, and return purchasing, looking at purchasing some higher health pigs to replace the inventory in the downtime frame, in the time frame that they were making the hole of stabilization. And some just chose to make that hole in the stabilization and not refill it as well. The other change that we saw were people made adjustments to their weaning age. Again, going back and evaluating the wean age that the farm was achieving. Oftentimes, what the goal is and what's happening are two different things. Again, we know that the older wean age may be more profitable for systems. The sow farm performance improves. We see better total born, shorter wean to first service, better farrowing rates. And in the pig performance, we see an easier pig to get started on feed, better average daily gain and mortality. And so again, some reasons to look at adjusting that wean age up. And again, once we went to evaluate that to see what the farm was actually getting done, like I say, oftentimes it's different than what you may have set out for a goal. And so it's oftentimes good to just get back to what the goal was. And oftentimes we find that the changes that have occurred really don't fit the system. Everything's tight, everything's difficult, and maybe a better fit to the gestation system to go back to an older weaning age and make the system easier to operate in the long run. And many times we've gone in and done this where historically we've gone into herds and cut production by cut the inventory by 10% and really not changed the output of pigs. Just got rid of some of the poor, less efficient sows and made the system work better. And so here's again, just a spreadsheet we put together and looking at how everything fits. And so here we're comparing a 19-day wean age to a 21-day wean age program. And in looking at this particular farm, we can see that the 19-day wean age really wasn't long-term sustainable, and that's what they were seeing, as well as that they weren't always getting there because they didn't have enough gestation space. Once we went back to the 21-day weaning age, then we had adequate space in the system. We had a little room in the system, a little flexibility in the system, and certainly made it easier to run over time. And so again, good exercises to go through just to make sure everything is fitting properly. Some farms took the opportunity here to go ahead and convert to a batch farrowing. And again, this has been an old technology that's somewhat returning back to the industry. When I first started practice 35 years ago, most of the farms I worked with were using batch systems. And predominantly the 5-group every 4-week system is what people are going to today, and was also the most popular in the past. Some farms use the 4-group every 5 weeks, gives you a little older wean age pig. And if you only have one nursery, fits the facilities a little bit better. In the past, we used some of the 4-group every 6 weeks. Again, if you only had one nursery, worked well. And here they didn't have the older wean age. They skipped all the sows and weaned the pigs at traditional time, got more time in the nursery, and had some very high productivity because every animal was had a skip heat for every breed. And then kind of a slower paced batch system of 3 groups every 7 weeks. So again, lots of different options for lots of different producers. Historically, the problems we had with the batch farrowing was keeping discipline in the breeding window. And if you can't do this and you open up the breeding window, that's when you lose the batch effect, and the whole system starts to fall apart at that point, and you start to lose the advantages. And part of the reason we had trouble in the past was we didn't have the synchronization products that are available today. And so we had to run a bigger gilt pool, and we had to breed, or the other option was to breed and abort sows to fit the groups. And that was also more of a challenge to get done as well. And batches do have the challenge that animals that fall out of groups are a little more difficult to get back on track and get back into a group. Again, requires synchronization, and ultimately a lot of these animals end up exiting the herd earlier, and we end up with higher replacement rates, and is probably a part of the system. So when we look at the batch system as far as advantages, certainly the advantages are on the wean to finish performance, far and away. Again, you're able to run the sites on an all-in, all-out by site basis, and you're able to run bigger sites. It improves the average daily gain mortality. And again, you can make a small farm flow like a large farm and give it the ability to run those sites run a reasonable size site and run it on an all-in, all-out by site basis for each group. Again, the advantages are the entire farrowing house is empty at a given time. No pigs are held back, and it allows the farm a break in the disease cycle. In the farrowing room, particularly such as influenza, some of the scour bugs, and allows for a good cleaning, disinfecting, and the breaking of the disease cycle, along with a little bit of older weaning age than most farms traditionally would have been doing. There are some advantages on the labor side. You're able to do 24-hour farrowing, because if you keep your breeding window tight, you're only having to do it for 3 days. It allows you to focus on each task independently as they're happening to the batch. So you're either in the farrowing process where you're assisting and getting pigs started, or you're processing, or you're weaning, or you're cleaning up, weaning and cleaning up, and then getting ready to breed again. So again, you're very focused on the task you're doing at the time, because you don't have the other tasks to be doing. It does allow some time for repairs in those time frames where there's not quite as much work, not quite as much activity. Also some time to schedule vacations in there. And if you can find part-time employees, you only have to pay the staff when they're needed. And so that certainly is an advantage as well. The disadvantages are you have to synchronize the gilts to get them into the herd, or any fallouts to get back into the herd. Again, it's one more task to do, and certainly doesn't come without a cost. And the work is really focused in a short period of time. There's really 2 weeks that are very intense, and at the time when you're breeding and farrowing, and then there's a couple more weeks that are a little less intense, but the work is very focused and can get overwhelming for a little bit. You do have a higher replacement rate, and management of labor can be a challenge. The part-time labor, it's not really easy to find somebody that's going to work full-time but only work a few days a month. If you can find that, that's great, but it is difficult to find those type of people out there. So again, those are some of the techniques we've done. One of the things we started talking about as these situations started coming up was, is there some sort of program we could put together like we had back in the 90s in the Pseudo-Rabies eradication program? The accelerated Pseudo-Rabies eradication program came in there, and we did some liquidation of herds to get those herds out of the system. And we said, can we do the same thing today? Could we do the same thing today and eliminate some other diseases such as the coronaviruses, APP, PRRS, MICO, or all the above? Whatever herds wanted to clean up, they could, and thinking this would be a possible mechanism to use to be able to do it. Unfortunately, there was no funding, there was no program disease in place, and there was no funding, and really didn't get the support of the industry to get started, and unfortunately didn't get the opportunity to move forward. I think in the future, as we look to the future, what are things we could do is develop some funding for programs like this, and possibly look at appropriating some checkoff funds to help with these kinds of needs. Have money available to help producers when these hard decisions of euthanizing pigs, and some indemnity to be paid when those situations occur, or putting together, like the APAP program, ways that we could long-term help the industry by going in and working on a disease eradication program or health stabilization plans that would improve the health status of the overall herd, and thinking outside the box and having other ways to react. But unfortunately, we weren't able to get these things done. The idea was, can we make the best out of a bad situation? But it doesn't work without funding, and I think long-term, as an industry, we need to look at possibly doing that funding ourselves. So in summary, again, problems can be an opportunity, and we never want to let a good crisis go to waste. And most of the programs that were set up in this time frame, we had to be creative, think out of the box, and get people to think differently about how they might look at their problems. And I think long term, it's an opportunity for us to think about going into the future as well, to be more prepared if other situations arise that are similar. And again, we need to, I think all of us need to look at the future and say, how can I make my herd more sustainable? Having a higher health herd certainly does that. Eliminating diseases certainly helps that. We improve performance, we lower the cost of production, and we set up the herd to give more predictable, achievable results. There's many different models, as we discussed this afternoon. The depopulation, repopulation, the herd closures certainly have become very popular. Making holes in production can add to a lot of herd stability. They may not go to elimination, but they can certainly help to stabilize those populations and reduce the level of disease and make it more manageable. And converting to a batch farrowing type system, again, allows you to run a better all-in, all-out system, particularly when we're talking about smaller flows and smaller systems. Again, all opportunities to improve the health. So again, as we come to the end of the day and the end of the talk, I think everyone needs to look in the mirror and ask themselves these questions. As producers, what can I do for my operation? And am I willing to make those changes to help improve my health status long term? As veterinarians and consultants, what can my clients do to better position themselves in the future to manage some of these health challenges? And how do we think out of the box to get those done? And with that, I'll take any questions. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Paul, for such useful information. And I think that after listening to you, I think everybody should consider those diseases, that aspects of disease, and how to manage, and the useful tools that you laid down today for them. Thanks everybody for listening today, and remember that the conference continues after the break at 3:30 p.m. We have more cutting-edge, science-driven information for you. And finally, remember, I want to remind you of the Swedish virtual celebration of the Swines in Practice awardee this year, Clayton Johnson. Thank you, everybody, and looking forward to seeing you in the next sections of the meeting.